Buenos días. Muchas gracias, Andres. I'm going to speak in English. I'm sorry. I'm a rational optimist. I think the world has been getting better for most of humanity, and it's going to go on getting better. And why do I think that? I think that because the human brain is expanding. Not the individual human brain, but the collective human brain. The brain that we build between our brains. And that, I think, is the story of the next 100 years as well as the last. This is a photograph I took out of the window of an aeroplane 2 days ago over London. And it's a city. It's a city which has got more people in it than ever before. And yet those people are richer, they live cleaner lives, and they live safer lives than ever before. How is that possible? How is it possible that when there are more people, they're better off? And if it's possible for a city, is it possible for a planet? This is a graph of world GDP per capita since the year zero. You can see that it took off in 1810, the year of Mexico's independence. But what happened over that period was an extraordinary transformation of people's livelihoods. And yet it was a time when the population was expanding dramatically. So we've got richer as we've got more numerous. How is that possible? How is it possible that as there are more of us, we live for longer, not shorter? How is it possible that as there are more of us, we're less likely to kill each other? How is it possible that as there are more of us, we're more charitable, we give more money to charity? How is it possible that as there are more of us, we're less likely to die of waterborne diseases? And how is it possible that we're less likely to die of accidents and heart disease and even cancer corrected for age? How is it possible that as there are more of us, we find more resources, not fewer? How is it possible that in some cases, in some countries above a certain level of income, the more people there are and the richer they are, the less pollution they experience? How is it possible that things get cheaper as we get more numerous? That's the question I think you need to answer if you're going to understand whether this can come to an end or whether this can continue. In other words, when we say to ourselves, this can't go on forever, we've got to understand how it has gone on so far if we are to understand whether it can go on forever. I want you to ask yourself how long you had to work to earn 1 hour of reading light. That is to say, if you go home this evening and you read a book, preferably my book, for 1 hour, by the light of an 18-watt compact fluorescent bulb, how long have you had to work, if you're on the average wage in the United States, say, to earn that much light? And the answer is about half a second. On the average wage today in America, half a second of work earns you enough light to read a book for an hour. Back in 1950, it was 8 seconds. And that is economic growth. Economic growth is not the accumulation of money, it's the accumulation of time. It's the fact that it takes you less long to fulfill one of your needs than it did before. And back in 1880, it would have taken you 15 minutes to earn an hour of reading light. And in 1800, 6 hours. The average person on the average wage in 1800 could not afford a candle. That's a measure of the improvement of our living standards, but it's in time. The crucial ingredient is time. What's caused this change? A change like that doesn't come about because our brains got bigger. And yet when we say to ourselves, what's special about human beings, the first thing we say is, well, we've got big brains. But we've had big brains for several 100,000 years. Neanderthals had brains that were just as big as us, and they didn't do any of this. Big brains are necessary, obviously, for this, but they don't begin to explain it, and nor do symbolism and language and all the other things we congratulate ourselves about. It looks like we've had language for several 100,000 years too, in some form, and symbolism for a very long time. Culture, too. We pride ourselves on our culture, but other species have culture. Killer whales have culture. Chimpanzees have culture. They teach each other how to crack nuts with rocks. But culture in itself doesn't explain these changes. Something has made our culture accelerate in the last few 100,000 years. And I think to understand what it is, you need to understand a proposition that was put forward by a London stockbroker in 1817 called the Law of Comparative Advantage. His name was David Ricardo, and he was trying to explain why it pays England to import things from Portugal, even if England is better at making everything than Portugal. Those were the days. But I've rephrased his law in Stone Age terms. I want you to imagine two people sitting around a campfire, Adam and Oz, and they both need a spear and an axe in order to go out hunting. Now, Oz is better at making spears and axes than Adam. He takes only 1 hour to make a spear and 2 hours to make an axe, whereas Adam takes 4 hours to make a spear and 3 hours to make an axe. So Oz doesn't need Adam, does he? He can just make his spear and his axe and go out hunting while Oz is still whittling away. Well, no, because if Oz were to make 2 spears and Adam were to make 2 axes and they were to trade, then they would each have saved 1 hour of work. They'd both be better off. And the point is, the more they do this, the more true it's going to be, because the more they do this, the better Adam gets at making axes and the better Oz gets at making spears. So exchange and specialization is a fast breeder reactor. It creates more of itself as it goes on. This is an object that sits on my desk at home. It's an Ashwalian hand axe made by Homo erectus probably 500,000 years ago. And it's made from a single substance, stone, and it's made to a design that didn't change for nearly 1 million years. And beside it sits this object, which is exactly the same size and shape, because it's designed, like the hand axe, to fit the human hand. And of course, it's 5 years old rather than 500,000 years old, and it's probably obsolete already. But there's another key difference. The object on the right is made from many different substances. It's made from plastic and metal and silicon, and it's not only that, it's made from many different ideas. The idea of plastic, the idea of semiconductors, the idea of computing. They all come together in it. It's an accumulation, a confection of different ideas. Now, my body is a confection of different ideas too. The idea of liver cells and the idea of brain cells, the idea of genes and things like that. How does evolution make cumulative things like that? Well, the answer is it uses sex. If you have a species which is not sexual, in which everybody is descended from a single parent, then any 2 mutations that appear are going to compete with each other to see which one is best. So in this case, a red mutation and a green mutation appear in the species, and the green mutation wins, the red one has to go extinct. But if the species is sexual, then at some point an individual is going to inherit both mutations. And if they're both good mutations, then they're going to come together. So what's happening in a sexual species is that individuals draw upon the inventive power of the whole species. They don't have to rely on the inventive power of just their own lineage. Now, something is happening in culture that is having the same impact as sex had in biology. And it's exchange. It's the habit of exchanging one object for another, one idea for another. It's trade, in a word. No other animal does this. Other animals swap one favor for the same favor at a different time, but swapping different objects at the same time, that doesn't happen in any other species. As Adam Smith famously said, no man ever saw a dog make fair exchange of a bone with another dog. And every technology we use, when you think about it, is a hybrid. It comes about by bringing together ideas from different directions. This is my favorite example, the camera pill, which was invented after a conversation between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. Go back to this image of the hand axe and the mouse and say to yourself, not just is it made from different substances, but who made it? Well, the mouse was made, the hand axe was made by someone for himself. Homo erectus made his own hand axes. He was self-sufficient in hand axes. But the mouse was made for me by other people. Very kindly, they all agreed to get together and coordinate their actions to make me a mouse. How many of them were there? Well, I think it's probably millions, because you've got to include the man who was brewing the coffee that was going to be used, that was growing the coffee that was going to be brewed for the man on the oil rig who was making the oil that was going to be used in the refinery to make the plastic, etc., etc., etc. Everybody was involved in this. And that's the secret of human culture, is that we work for each other and we combine our knowledge in this way. Now, having other people working for you is indeed one way of being rich. You can employ them directly. In the old days, that was how Bronze Age emperors and kings got rich. Louis XIV had a lot of people working for him. It's a fair bet that he didn't make that fancy outfit for himself. Louis XIV had 498 people to prepare his dinner every night. But here's a group of tourists going around the Palace of Versailles, Louis XIV's palace, today. Every single one of them has got 498 people preparing his or her dinner tonight. They're working in bistros and cafes and restaurants and shops all over Paris, but they're ready at 1 hour's notice to serve a decent meal to each of these people. Probably a better meal than Louis XIV had. It's more likely to have mangoes in it, and it's less likely to have salmonella in it. Other animals work for each other too, particularly the social insects. Very good example is in ants, where this is a worker ant feeding a queen ant. But there's a big difference. In social insects, it's one big family. Everybody is working for each other within the family. There's no working for strangers. And why is this? Because they also have a reproductive division of labor. That is to say, they also divide the labor of reproduction. They give it to the queen. Now that's the one thing we don't do. We insist on doing reproduction for ourselves. Even in England, we don't ask the Queen to do the reproducing for us. And the consequence of that is that we work for strangers in a way that social insects can't. Now, when did this habit of working for each other begin? Well, I think it probably began with the sexual division of labor. I can't prove this, but it looks like the oldest version of people working for each other. Men hunt and women gather. It's a beautiful system because what it means is that each side saves time, each side gains a standard of living out of it. Because the woman knows that if she wants access to protein, all she has to do is dig up some extra roots which she can swap for meat. And the man knows that if he wants staple carbohydrate, all he has to do is make sure he kills a big enough warthog to share some. We don't know when this started, but there's a good suggestion that it didn't happen in Neanderthals, that it was a peculiar habit of the Africans from whom we're descended. And it might have got us into the habit of working for each other, of specialization and exchange. And at some point, we crossed an extraordinary threshold. We started specializing and exchanging not just between individuals, but between groups, between tribes. This is the oldest evidence for trade. These are seashells used as beads, but the peculiarity of them is that they're found more than 100 miles inland from the coast of Algeria. And when you find objects traveling that long distance, it means that trade has been invented. They date from between 80,000 and 120,000 years ago. And around that time in Ethiopia, you also see jasper and obsidian and other objects moving long distances. And why does long distance movement of objects mean trade? Well, because if you look at modern hunter-gatherers, you find that trade coincides with the movement of objects for long distances. So here's some stone axes made at a place called Mount Isa in Australia by a tribe called the Kalkadoon. And the Kalkadoon swapped these axes with their neighbors for things like stingray barbs, and the consequence is that you can find Mount Isa stone axes all over Australia. This is evidence of trade, not migration. So when this happened, around 100,000 years ago, 10 times as old as agriculture, trade is, I think it had an extraordinary accelerant effect on human culture. These are fishing equipment from the Pacific, Maori fishing tackle. And if you look at different Pacific islands, you find that the sophistication of their fishing technology depends on the size of their population. The size of the island population determines the sophistication of the technology. And more than that, even in some quite small populations, you get sophisticated technology because those islands are in contact with other islands. So being in contact with other islands or having a large population is what causes a sophistication of technology. And that's because it allows this specialization and exchange, which is the secret of human inventiveness. And what happens if you cut people off from specialization and exchange, from trade? The answer is not only does their technology stop advancing, it can actually go into reverse. Tasmania was cut off as an island 10,000 years ago. The 4,000 or so people who lived on it had a perfectly natural component of Aboriginal technology at the time. But over the next 4,000 years, they steadily gave up their technologies because 4,000 people is not enough to sustain the different specialized skills to keep technologies alive. They lost the ability to make bone tools, they lost the ability to make clothing, they lost the ability to make fishing equipment. This didn't happen on Tierra del Fuego, a very similar island, same kind of climate, same kind of number of people over the same period. Why not? Because the Magellan Strait is narrow and there was trading contact across it. The Bass Strait is wide, there was isolation. So human beings work as a collective brain. The bigger the group, the more contact between the group, the more inventiveness they show. Go back to this image of the hand axe and the mouse once more, and ask yourself not just who made the mouse, but who knew how to make it. The answer is nobody. Nobody knows how to make a computer mouse. Nobody knows how to make a pencil even. There was a famous essay in 1958 by an economist called Leonard Read called I, Pencil, in which a pencil tried to work out how it came into being and concluded that nobody on the planet knew how to make it. The president of the pencil company doesn't know how to make a pencil, he knows how to run a company. The man who mines graphite in Sri Lanka knows how to do that, but he doesn't know how to cut down trees and so on. We all know little bits of the whole, but none of us knows the whole. And so we're capable of doing things with this collective brain that we cannot even understand with our individual brains. That's an extraordinary thought when you think about it. And by the way, that's why I'm not interested in debates about IQ. I couldn't care less whether one racial group has a higher IQ or a lower IQ than another, because that's not going to determine their achievement. What's going to determine their achievement is how well they're communicating. 100 stupid people talking to each other are going to achieve much more than 100 clever people on their own. So we're using a collective brain to solve our problems. And here it is. Here's the modern version of it. This is the internet. This is Tim Berners-Lee's invention, as it were, the web. But it looks like one of Henry Markram's diagrams from yesterday. It looks like a brain. This is a map of the internet at work. And we've just created a way of connecting people all across the planet with this device that is infinitely superior to anything we've had before in the way of trade or communication. So surely we're going to see an acceleration of inventiveness, not a deceleration. And this is why I think it can continue for a lot longer yet. These are the estimations that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change give for GDP over the next 100 years, per capita. And they all assume a rising level of world income. What would happen if we continued increasing per capita GDP at the same rate that we did in the last 50 years? And the answer is we would increase the average income of the average person on the planet 9-fold. Each person would be 9 times as rich. So if Terry Grossman is right and he enables us all to live to 2100, then each of us in this room could multiply our salary in real terms, corrected for inflation, by 10, or 9, sorry. That's the kind of achievement we could do if we're on the trajectory we're on. But what if we were to accelerate it through the invention of better communications? It's a really quite startling thought. And the only limited resource we have is brain power, is ideas and connectivity. So we've gone from the self-sufficiency of Homo erectus to the collective brain of today. Thank you.